1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Steve Flamsteed. Most people know Steve for his 20-year stint crafting groundbreaking single-vineyard wines at giant steps in the Yarra Valley in Victoria, Australia. These days he's passing his fathomless wisdom onto others in his role at Wine Network Consulting, while he still makes Yarra Chardonnay with his mate Dave McIntosh under the Salo label, and unveiled a new project called Decades from Tasmania's Coal River Valley late last year. Pinot Noir is an obsession, and we recorded a bonus episode purely focused on Australian iterations of this grape. For this episode, however, we talked about pheasant farm feasting on exemplary hospitality, never minding the bollocks or the buzzcocks as a die-hard music fan, cutting the lunch of the Chamonix Chalet girls, moving fast and breaking things in an established wine region, camping with the cows as a French cheesemaking apprentice, and why wine shows might finally be onto a winner. I started by asking Steve what shaped the fledgling Flamsteed persona.
I grew up in Toowoomba, which is up in sort of southeastern Queensland. I'm one of 6 kids, and Dad he began a tractor and earth moving equipment company, so he serviced a lot of farmers out in the west. So Dad was away quite a lot, and Mum was obsessed with being surrounded by kids. So as well as having 6 kids, we lost my big brother when I was quite young in a really unfortunate traffic accident. And I think maybe partly Mum's response was just to keep herself surrounded by children. So as well as all of us, there was a couple of foster kids came in and out, and there was boarders from school, because we all went to, even though we were day students, we went to a boarding school. So that, there was generally sort of 5 or 6 or 7 kids in the house. And I loved eating, and I think I developed a bit of a love for cooking. Mum just could not keep up with with keeping the cake tin full. So I cooked quite a lot from about the age of sort of 12, 13 years of age. I guess that passion, it never went away. It was a hobby that became a bit more of an obsession. And at school, we had a really good French teacher, and he was right into food as well. So I guess in some ways, I've developed a little bit of an obsession with France, but mainly to do with the food and the culture that went on over there. Like, there's this mob of people who are just obsessed with eating and cheese and, all these amazing things. So that kind of chugged along through my childhood. So when I finished school, like a lot of us, in that era, there was this sort of pressure to go to university, and if you got a decent score, you went to uni, and uni was free back then. So even our teacher said to us, look, if you're not sure what you want to do, none of us really did, you should go to uni, because even if you're a grave digger, you'll be like an educated grave digger. And I just thought, yeah, okay, I should go to uni. So I applied and got into an arts degree, but I was still just in the back of my mind wanting to be a chef or a cook. So in December of the year after we finished school, I jumped in Mum's car and drove down to Brizzy, and just started knocking on doors and ended up getting an apprenticeship as a chef, and then sort of made that decision to go that way. Spent 2 years at a very conventional kind of conservative gentleman's club called the Brisbane Club, which was great because it sort of taught you all the basics. And I spent the second 2 years of my apprenticeship at a sort of more avant-garde restaurant called Rags, which was pretty groovy, and, got to understand food probably a little bit more in the way of flavour. Yeah.
Did you get into the sort of camaraderie or the culture of the kitchen in those days, or were you kind of just doing your own thing in quite a focused way?
It's interesting. I mean, this is back in 1983, and apprenticeships, particularly back then, and when you went to a kitchen brigade system like the Brisbane Club was, there was, executive chef, sous chef, commie chefs, blah, 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 right down the rank. And you came in as an apprentice, and you're absolutely the scum of the earth. You were, I think for the first 6 weeks, I peeled carrots and potatoes. And in some ways, they tried to break you a little. That was, the apprenticeships back in those days. You certainly learnt some peeling and knife skills, but you also learnt this sort of element of respect, and also I think that it wasn't easy. And I think, if the apprentices stuck around and kind of got through that initial stage, it probably showed a bit of grit. And I'm kind of glad I did it in some ways, because that sort of organised kitchen brigade system was probably quite good for me in terms of it gave me a bit of rigour, and I was a bit of a brat at school, so it kind of taught me that there were guidelines within which you need to learn some of these skills, and effectively learning a trade back in those days particularly. So, but interestingly, going from there and having learned all of those kind of classics into a sort of a groovy restaurant that was doing more interesting things, and working for a chef who really, food was all about texture and flavour and taste and everything. It was just like, oh my God, there's another world to this, and that was quite an eye-opener. yeah, I guess I did buy into it, but also was pretty happy to get that grounding, but also to take a step aside from that. Yeah.
And growing up in a house with lots of other kids around you, apart from the chance to cook for a lot of people, were there any other things that sort of fed off you? What kind of play did you get up to?
We lived, on the edge of the bush, so we'd disappear on weekends and on school holidays. We didn't really go away very much. We went to the coast occasionally, but we would just disappear at sort of 7 o'clock in the morning and come back home at 6 o'clock at night. And Mum knew roughly where we were. She knew that we were reasonably safe. We knew all the places to drop in and eat of our mates up the road, and so Mum kind of knew we were being fed somewhere because it sort of came back to her occasionally as well. And yeah, we just learned to muck around a lot. We got in a bit of trouble. We lived on the edge of a quarry. That was plenty of fun, chucking stuff over the side of the cliff and seeing what happened when it hit the ground. And I had a big brother and a little brother and a big sister and little sister and all of their friends and the kind of the other kids around the place. So there was always plenty of fun and plenty of mucking around and plenty of sport and quite a feeling of safety as well in a place like Toowoomba. So yeah, I'm sure Mum never knew where we were and didn't know what we got up to, but she was always pretty comfortable we were safe. Yeah.
And is that where your love of music came from that era, or did that come later with the working environments that you're into?
I just always loved music from a young age. I was probably a little bit young for the punk era, but I loved that punk era of music, the sort of late 70s, and probably identified with that a bit. I probably got into that probably more like in the early 80s, and so it had already kind of happened. But I love the rawness and the energy of that style of music. And there was a couple of bands in Brizzy we'd get to see, and when I was a bit older, and a few bands in Toowoomba that were sort of cutting their teeth. But yeah, I've always loved music and have never stopped loving music.
And so what were the sort of formative records that you were playing to death back in those days?
The first record I ever owned and bought with my own money was Brian Ferry, Let's Stick Together. I guess the ones that really formed a passion for the raw energy of music was the Sex Pistols, Nevermind the Bollocks, and the Buzzcocks, Singles Going Steady, and The Clash, London Calling, and those kind of standards. And that everywhere you looked there, you open up another door, and you keep exploring down these rabbit holes. But it was the rawness of the energy that I just loved. Yeah,
absolutely. And where did you go to after the kitchens of Brisbane?
So finished my apprenticeship in Brizzy. Immediately bought a ticket overseas to go to France because I just had to get there. I bought a two-way ticket, but I didn't have any intention about coming home. I was kind of off, and off on an adventure. And like most young Aussies, landed in London, had no money, and thought, I'll just get to London and then I'll just get over to France and everything will be fine. And of course you get there and you realise you have to get a job. And so I worked in London for about 9 months and eventually answered an ad in a magazine called The Rose, which was basically chasing chalet girls, and offering jobs on the continent for nannies and stuff like that. One of my girlfriends, I should say, was a nanny at the time. And I saw an ad in the corner of one of the pages saying chalet girls wanted for Chamonix. And I thought, Chamonix, that's in France. I think the skill set said must clean and cook and work hard. And, there's a ski pass thrown in. So I answered the ad, had the interview in London next day and said, look, I'm not a girl, but I can cook and I can clean and I'm happy to work hard. And I just want to get over to France. And she said, okay, right. And so she said, when can you leave? And I said, I can leave tomorrow. And she said, okay, well then she thought about it for overnight and the next day called me and I was on a plane to Geneva the next day.
Fantastic.
Ended up in Chamonix, worked there for a winter. It was great because being a chef, it was kind of easy. I just had to cook for 12 or 13 people in a big chalet and make sure there was a nice cake when they got home from skiing. And I met some really interesting people. And from that, got a job down in Spain for the summer, working on a boat as a deckhand just outside Mallorca. And from there ended up over in Beaujolais again, just having that kind of not necessarily any agenda. So you just kind of roll with where things took you. And I ended up going for a picking job in Beaujolais. And I kind of knew roughly where that was. I knew that they made wine out of Beaujolais. I didn't really know what the variety was or anything. And I ended up falling into this place owned by a really lovely family, the St. Charles family. When I arrived, he said, can you speak French? And I said, I can speak a bit of French. And he's like, well, you can work in the winery because the winemaker this year's Australian, a guy named Dean Hewitson. And he can't speak any French and you can drag hoses around for him and help translate a bit. And Dean, I don't know if you know Dean, but he's an exceptional bloke. And he just took me under his wing and explained to me as essentially a young chef, how you made wine. We had this grape and it fermented, and in that case, obviously whole bunch fermentation, and how long it spent on skins and what we did while the grapes were fermenting on skins, and we talked about texture and flavors and tannins, and it's like a light bulb went off. And the other thing was that at night we were staying in the castle, this beautiful old 16th century castle owned by Jean de St. Charles, and he'd go down to the cellar and bring up crusty old bottles that his grandfather had made, at the beginning of the Second World War, that they hid from the Germans, and all these crazy stories and beautiful wines. And to me, it just seemed like an extension of cooking. So I kind of got the bug and asked Dean how you became a winemaker, and he said, well, you've got to go to this place called Roseworthy back in Australia and do a science degree. And so I went home and the following year applied for Roseworthy and got in as a mature age student.
So who was in your cohort at Roseworthy?
Dave Bicknell, Kerry Thompson, Louisa Rose. We had a good mob, actually. Brad Rogers, who became a brewer. There was only about 20 of us, but a good mob.
Bit of a star-studded cast. And did you take to... I mean, you come from this sort of chefing background, then had that real light bulb moment with the connections, I guess, that you were making in your head, listening to Dean in the winery in Beaujolais. Did you find Roseworthy was ticking other boxes that you didn't know were there to be ticked?
Learning that science as a chef, it's funny, a whole lot of cooking began to make sense to me about pH and microbial spoilage and tannins and food textures and proteins. And, a lot of the wine science made the cooking science make sense to me. So I kind of wish I'd done a science degree before I started cooking. I probably would have got a different take on the whole cooking thing as well. Yeah, it definitely, say this to my kids too, and they've actually kind of done it. Two of them, or three of them actually, have all done some kind of science degree, because once you have science, the world begins to make sense.
When you were at Roseworthy, what kind of connections did you make and what kind of gigs did you pick up work experience-wise?
I had to pay the rent, so we all had part-time jobs. I shared a house with Dave Bicknell and Nikki Harris, and we all love to eat and we love to drink, but none of us had any money. So I got a job with Maggie Beer at the pheasant farm, which was really great because it kept our household fed with all the leftovers I brought home at the end of the weekend. I got into cooking because I loved feeding people. And then I learnt my trade in cooking and learnt my skills and, travelled a bit with it. But I feel like sometimes I never really understood the essence of cooking and real hospitality until I started working for Maggie. And as a part-time chef, I'd work Saturday, Sunday in the kitchen, and Saturday night I'd sometimes do out the front as well. So it was a real kind of, bit of everything at the pheasant farm back in those days. But Maggie's got this kind of, because she's not a qualified chef, her cooking is all about just making people happy. And she talks a lot about food texture and meat texture. And I learned to rest meat, things like, I never really thought too much about that before, about how proteins needed to be sort of, if you'd done some fierce cookery to them, they needed to be rested so they're relaxed and retain their juices. It's just another level of cooking and an understanding of food and flavour that I didn't really have in my resume. So while I was learning winemaking at Roseworthy and science, I was kind of learning to understand food and cookery with Maggie on the weekends. So it was this kind of dual education. And, it helped me pay the rent. And also, like I said, I'd get sent home on Sunday night with a bag full of goodies that were leftovers from the restaurant. Nikki and Dave would be sitting at home with their knife and fork ready and a bottle of wine open. And we'd sit down and have, pheasant pate and leftover pheasant and stuff like that. So it was good times, yeah.
And I guess much as you had a deep immersion in Beaujolais in a cultural sense, the way of doing things, I guess, in a castle, dragging up bottles from the cellar and sharing and, all the obvious things that you see when you're immersed in a place where things happen and there are traditions behind it. Did you get a sense in South Australia as well of the South Australian wine culture?
Wine culture is an interesting expression because the whole wine community is full of this sort of culture of sharing and knowing people and sharing knowledge, and I guess sharing wine. And every wine person you come across loves eating. So you're almost always eating with somebody when you're talking about wine, and they're inviting you for dinner or you're inviting you to stay. And I think that's why we make such deep and strong connections with people in the wine community and wine industry. South Australia is kind of special too in that it's got that incredible Mediterranean climate. So they have an understanding of raw ingredients, olive oil and olives and, saltbush fed lamb and a lot of these things that I hadn't really come across before that are quite unique to that area. Quinces, I'd never really had much to do with quinces till I started working with Maggie and, the place is just immersed in quinces. And so, yeah, I think, that dry Mediterranean climate certainly informs a certain style of cooking and culture. And the pheasant farm was the epitome of the entire thing.
And what sort of job avenues opened up after Roseworthy for you?
I guess while I was in France too, I got a bit of a bug for cheese. And so when I came back and studied and I learned, the science of wine and the science of dairy is not really that far apart. So I had this kind of side thing going on in my head of I wanted to be a cheesemaker. And so I finished Roseworthy a little bit confused because I guess the science and the food and the wine and the dairy side of things that was going on in the back of my mind were all kind of coalescing. I think what I'd like to have done, if it was physically possible, would have been to be a winemaker, a chef and a cheesemaker at the same time. So I thought I'd better explore cheese making to some degree before I kind of pushed off the resume. And back in those days, it was very difficult to get a job as a cheesemaker. Cheeseries in Australia were all very small and very crafty and generally owner-operated. And being owner-operated didn't really require too many staff and didn't really have time to probably teach too many people skill. So I took that concern to a mob called the Queen's Trust, and I applied for a grant saying, look, I want to learn about cheese and I want to bring some skills, but I'm struggling to get them in Australia. And I think I'd like to go overseas and try and find some skills over there and bring them back. And they said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So they gave me a little bit of money. And I went back over to France and spent 9 months in the Alps, landed in a place just in a little village called Thon, Thones, that was making a cheese called Reblochon, which I was kind of obsessed with. And I went knocking on doors up the road from the village in my very best French. It was pretty funny. I knocked on the door, it's like Fromagerie Bibolet, and I said that I was Australian and that I wanted to learn to make cheese and I was prepared to work very hard and I didn't need to be paid. I just needed somewhere to stay. That was like the 5 lines I got together. And the guy's like, can you say that again? And I said, I'm Australian. No. And he said, you want to work for nothing? And I said, yeah. And he said, and you just need somewhere to stay? And I said, yeah. He said, where's your bags? And so they're down in the village at the youth hostel, drove down, picked up my bags, came back up, and I started work the next day. And had an amazing experience with them, spent 3 months on that farm. Word got around that there was this stupid Australian who was happy to work for nothing. So his cousin was making a cheese called Beaufort, and which is, wasn't too far away physically. And they needed staff to go up into the Alpage, which is, up above the tree line, and basically you camp up there for 2 or 3 months with a generator and they milk the cattle up there and make 1 or 2 cheese per day, depending on the yield. So I spent 3 months up in the mountains with those guys, and then I came back down and worked in a little goat's cheese farm for 3 months after that. So that was a really cool experience and just got me back into France, which was great fun. But I came home from there sort of as confused as ever because I now wanted to be a cheesemaker. And I worked for a little mob called Miller Cheese for David Brown in the northeast of Victoria. And that was great fun. But I think making cheese in Australia and making cheese over in Europe are obviously, very different things. In Australia, it's much more about pasteurised milk and you're in a hairnet and gloves and everything's very clean. And in some ways, I guess, the romance wasn't quite there, but we still made some beautiful cheese. So ended up in the northeast, and I just got a little tiny bit disillusioned, not with Brownie or Miller Cheese, because they're beautiful people. But I just decided that working in a cheese cold room in Australia wasn't probably the way I saw my life going. And just by chance, around the corner up the road in a little village called Oxley in northeast Victoria, there was a restaurant that came up for sale. And to get in there was basically very cheap. And I rang my brother up and sort of asked him what he was doing. He was just kicking around traveling as well. And I said, look, you should come back over to Australia. He was in Africa. And we could start this restaurant together and I can cook and you can run front of house and I'll make the wine and I can make a bit of cheese on the side and it'll be amazing. And he's like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. So he came home and we started up a little place called the King River Cafe. And we ran that for about 3 or 4 years. We sold it after 4 years, had a great time, did lots of regional produce. And, we made our own bread. We made our own pasta twice a day. We made a bit of fresh milk curd. We used Miller cheese quite a lot. I made a house white and a house red, met some really cool people, had a great time. Made a tiny bit of money too, which was nice. But by the end of that one, by this stage, I'm sort of getting close to 28 years old and I'm starting to sort of grow up and back into this sort of dream in my head. I wanted to be a cheesemaker, a winemaker and a chef. But I decided at that stage, in Australia, it's really important that you do one thing very well. You can't be everything to everybody, particularly in those kind of skill sets. If you're going to make cheese, it's got to be amazing. If you're going to make wine, it's got to be amazing. If you're going to run a restaurant, you have to be an incredible chef or cook. And so I decided winemaking was probably the avenue I wanted to go down. We sold our restaurant. Plus, we've been working pretty hard for 4 years. We're literally working 6-7 days a week. And Willie and I are both a little bit burnt out. So I got a job at Lewin Estate, which is great. Then went over there as assistant winemaker. That was in 1999.
Brilliant. I wish I'd been around for the King River Cafe. I had no idea about that chapter. And, well, I guess that you probably would have been putting a lot of your experiences in hospitality and those things that you love, the cheese, the wine, and everything else, into that place. It must have been a pretty cool experience and to scratch that itch. Before we go on, I want to go back to the cheese just very briefly. With Reblochon, Beaufort, goat's cheese, what would be your wine pairings for those?
Reblochon's hard because it's such a strong flavoured cheese and it's kind of like whatever you have it with, it kind of murders the wine. And that's why I think it goes pretty well with those really steely Savoy whites, Sauvignon or something that's almost a bit neutral kind of works well there because that pairing is much more about the cheese than the wine because it's such a dominant, strong flavour and texture and smell and, it's just a cheese that kind of literally you lift up the hood and it kind of takes over the entire room. Yep. And it's one of the world's great cheeses when it's in good condition too. And with the Beaufort, I actually quite like, because we can get some good stuff in Australia. The summer stuff comes out to Australia, the Alpine gear, and Sophie in Hillsville brings it in. And I quite like that with Yarra Valley Chardonnay, because I like the minerally, steely, lemon, citrus thing. And that is a very yeasty, nutty cheese. And I think those two just seem to pair really beautifully. And the goat's cheese I made was a little crotons, was the one that this guy did. That was his sort of the cheese he was quite famous for and took down to the market. So they were good as fresh. They were kind of a white geotrichum mold on the outside. And then when they got a little bit of age, they became quite hard. So you could sort of shave them or grill them over bread in a salad. Probably with those, they're pretty good with more of an aromatic white like Riesling. But again, dry and quite steely.
Very nice. So back to Margaret River then, Lewin Estate. What kind of place did you discover? What were the first things that hit you when you moved to Margaret River?
Well, I've got to say, it was another example of, the generosity and kind of culture of the wine community. But, the Horgans are a really beautiful, very generous family. And they took a bit of a risk on me because, you look at my CV. I mean, it might have been interesting, but it looked pretty shithouse, This guy can't make up his mind. So taking me on as an assistant winemaker in such an important place, like, it was a massive risk, I reckon, on their part, and I really admire them for it. I got in just through a connection. Somebody suggested that I might have been okay and, worth a crack. And obviously that's a wine that's got an incredible pedigree and an incredible ageability or cellar abilities. I got there in 99. We were drinking the 85 and 87 and even the 81, three of the really great Lewins, all of which were beautiful, all of which, were under cork. And, but just the most amazing wines, some of the most amazing Chardonnay I've drunk in my life. The 87 Lewin Chardonnay, if you've ever had it, it's just mind-bogglingly good. It was interesting. What was going through my head was Lewin Chardonnay was a wine very much based on flavour. They were quite large wines. They were generally somewhere between 13.5 and 14.5% alcohol back in those days. And I think I learnt about Chardonnay flavour and, 100% new oak as well. And so that was a real eye-opening thing for me because I liked Chardonnay, but I guess I learnt to really love Chardonnay over there and probably learnt to understand Chardonnay, at least that dimension of Chardonnay, quite a lot better. And also, it was my first real winemaking job, so I was just learning literally a year in a winery. I mean, I'd never bottled a wine properly before in a proper place. So, stabilities and laboratory stuff and helping run vintage and managing staff and cellar hands and, most of whom were kind of surfies, the cellar hands and, just managing a bit of a culture. It was really good, a really good experience. And plus a really, really lovely community over there, like, Ginny Wilcox and all that crew were all there. Glenn Goodall was over there at that stage. There was plenty of people having plenty of fun over there. So great place. We spent 3 years there. We had our first baby there in Margaret River Hospital, and she still tells people she's a West Australian because she was born in Margaret River.
So between those choices that you made, your sort of forking path of cheese, chefing and wine, when you started there, you thought that Lewin took a bit of a punt on you. Did you surprise yourself with how well you acquitted yourself having taken the plunge?
Yeah, a fair bit of imposter syndrome. Like I had to convince people I knew what I was doing, and I didn't, really. So I love working hard. I mean, I've always loved working hard and I still love working hard. So I think if you work hard, people sort of develop some kind of respect for you and you kind of lead from the front. So, I never would have asked anyone to do anything I wasn't prepared to do. And whether that was cleaning out the septic or racking Chardonnay, So
how long did you stay at Lewin and what came next?
3 years at Lewin. We'd had our first baby and, Margaret River's a long way from northeast Victoria where Jano, my wife's from. And there was a bit of this pull to come back near the family. And I got offered a job at Yarraburn by Peter Dawson. The label Yarraburn existed, but they were going to build a winery. So they were taking on more of a sort of a Yarraburn team. That was back when Hardy's owned Yarraburn. So I came back over to the eastern states for that job. And it was tough to make that decision, especially telling mates in Margaret River that you were leaving Margaret River to go live in Victoria. They thought I was actually a bit mad. Because, you're leaving one of the most beautiful places in the world to, in their opinion, over in the bloody east. But
yeah, well, you still don't hear that many people making that move. Plenty going the other way.
No one leaves Margaret River. Yeah. But I'm really glad we did because, I got to the Yarra and landing in the Yarra, I mean, Hardy's had their issues. Back then it was pretty heady times. And so even though the Yarraburn winery never eventuated because, of sort of corporate ownership changed and all that kind of stuff, getting into the Yarra was probably the most important part of my wine career, really, because I took this understanding of Chardonnay and a single vineyard concept at Lewin and was able to apply that to an entirely different climate and different wine, different style of Chardonnay over here. And the other thing that the Yarra offered, of course, was Pinot Noir. That became a bit of an obsession from that point onwards for me. So those two varieties were pretty much all that mattered by the time we hit the Yarra. And so about a year and a half after I'd started with Hardy's, when it was pretty clear that Hardy's were going a particular way and that winery was never going to happen, I met Phil Sexton at a Pinot workshop, and he had a pretty cool vineyard up in Gruyere, and he was talking about building a winery, and I just wanted to build a winery. I wanted to be involved in a place that had its own vineyard and its own winery. So I joined Phil in 2003, and we were making our wines at Dominic Porte's winery back in those days. And then sort of went on from there, really. We built what became the Innocent Bystander, Giant Steps Winery, and fast forward sort of 20 years, here we are today. Yeah.
Well, just a little bit on Phil. By that stage, and sort of continuing really to make some pretty bold decisions that turn into pretty big things. What kind of character did you discover in Phil, and what was exciting about working with someone like that?
It's a really good question. Hey, I worked for some really strong people, and by strong I mean strong-willed and driven people like Maggie. Like, Maggie's just driven, but she's got this innate kind of like generosity and beauty, and so you kind of become absorbed with Maggie, and you kind of get on board. And working with her in the kitchen, she's like a whirlwind, and you sort of follow the whirlwind round, and every service was like a performance. At the end of the performance she'd be completely drained, and then she'd get back in for the next performance. But in the meantime, we were preparing food, between lunch and dinner. And so, working at Pheasant Farm was full on. You're either in or you're out. And then Phil was kind of a different sort of driven. Like, Phil was driven in a way that anything in the world was possible. There was nothing that was not possible with Phil Sexton. It's no secret that the whole the Giant Steps brand began with a vineyard called Sexton Vineyard. It was called the Giant Steps Vineyard back then. But it took the launching of a company like Innocent Bystander to actually finance growth in Giant Steps. So we're only ever going to be one vineyard until we had an underlying company that could actually produce some volume and a couple of different wine styles that, we could make and sell quickly, like Moscato, Pinot Gris. And that sort of supported, us going and finding other single vineyard sites like Applejack, and leasing other long-term sites like Tarraford. In the end, we were making 50,000 cases of Moscato, and we were doing cider, and we were doing all kinds of wacky stuff because we could. So we'd have an idea and we'd go, okay, let's do it. So he had this incredible energy and drive that, particularly back in those days, in the early days, was just infectious. We did every single trade show. We did every single wine event. We were at every Victorian winemakers exhibition, every single good food and wine show. And people would come up to us and they go, oh, I know you guys. I saw you here last year. I know Innocent Bystander. I know Giant Steps. I met Phil, I met Suze, Susie Tyzak, who ran our marketing and sales, and met you, Steve, you're the winemaker, and blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, we had this relationship with all these people. So yeah, it was 24 hours nonstop, gung-ho. And it wasn't for everybody. Some people loved it, and we had some incredible crew along the way, and some people, it just wasn't for them.
Yeah, I mean, from the outside looking in, it almost looked, I suppose, like the energy of a tech startup. Going back to that sort of template, there wasn't really anything at the time, because I guess the famous names of the Yarra Valley, often they were built on single vineyards themselves.
Yep.
In some cases have been there for a long time. I suppose places like Wantirna Estate or Yeringberg or Yarra Yering, a different setup. And then you sort of did come along and rewrite the rule book a little bit on how to run something, how to create new products to get excited about. But also the single vineyard program grew up, it seemed, pretty fast. And that's become something that I guess has been rolled out across other places. Let's dwell on that for a second.
Phil and I tasted the Kistler wines one day. We went through the range there. I'm not sure how we got them. They came out here with Gavin from Old Bridge Cellars. And, there must have been 5 or 6 wines in the range. This is back in the early 2000s. And every one of them was unique and quite different. And so what began with the Sexton Vineyard, and then we leased Tarraford Vineyard, and we made wine from Applejack Vineyard. He didn't know it back in those days. Going back to the Innocent Bystander concept, Innocent Bystander was very much a wine that was some of its parts. It was lots of different bits and pieces put together, and, the sum of the parts was something quite lovely and delicious. But what we realized along the way is all these individual components were kind of exciting too. I mean, it was initially probably a little bit of risk management. In a warm year in the Yarra Valley, you wanted to be in the upper Yarra, and in a cool year, having those lower sites was quite handy. But along the way, we began to understand how special some of these individual sites really are, regardless of the vintage. It might be a warm year, but even then, Sexton Vineyard made quite interesting, dark, brooding Pinot Noir. And, in a cool year, Applejack made some really highly perfumed, really tense, lovely, delicious perfumed wine. And then we took our wines over to the UK, and we're showing them at Jancis Robinson and having this conversation. This is back in an era where we'd just come out of the whole critter label, and Australian wine was a bit like, the sunshine in the bottle was being talked about, and it was kind of losing its excitement to some degree. It was all pretty nice and nothing particularly exciting. And so we would generally begin conversations with people like her, not with the word Australian wine, but with the word Yarra Valley. And then the next conversation was about the the Sexton vineyard or the Applejack vineyard or Tarifa vineyard. So it was single sites in a very special wine region that was suited to the varieties we were talking about, like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. I hate to give any credit to the French, but the French obviously worked that out a long time ago, that these finite pieces of real estate could produce something quite special that was beyond the winemaker, that was beyond the custodian of the site. These sites live on, and we, as winemakers and vignerons, we come and go. But there's something really unique about not every single site, but certain sites, and they produce a wine that has a personality. And so what happened is Giant Steps started producing a lineage of single vineyard wines that actually in their own right developed a following. So some people would come into Cellador and they'd say, I love the Tarifa Chardonnay, that's my thing. And you go, well, we've got these other ones too. And like, yeah, but I like Tarifid, or you'd show them, a Pinot from Primavera and they'd go, I love that, it's cool, but it's interesting, but I actually really like the Applejack, that's my one. So these wines got their own little fan clubs, which was quite cool, and they're all about the site. And we made a point of actually making the winemaking pretty straightforward. So the Chardonnays are all, hand-picked, whole bunch pressed, wild ferment, so that the individual vineyard characters were quite unique because the winemaker was in some ways the standard. And similarly with Pinot Noir, there was variations on whole bunch, but it was the site that was the variable, particularly when you do a lineup of all the vineyards in the one vintage. So the vintage is the standard, the winemaking is relatively standard, and the individual vineyard is the variable. And that's great fun. And when you show that to people in Cellador, we did a lot of Cellador work too, by the way. It was a thing that we made as part of the business that all the winemakers had to do sometime in Cellador. And you put those single vineyard wines in front of somebody and have that chat and point to spots on a map of different altitudes, and it all just kind of makes sense. They go, okay, like I get it, they're all different.
Yeah.
And they're all beautiful and they're all interesting, but you might like one over the other, but they're all exciting and individual.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, really, I suppose part of that point of doing that, as you say, is it's almost establishing a track record gives people an opportunity to connect, identify with, and follow something. And it's one thing to follow a brand, I suppose, but another thing to dig down a little bit deeper and develop an affection for something smaller, which I guess, as you say, it's kind of what the French worked out, but maybe something that Australia is finding a little bit more potential joy with now, and a little bit of way to go there, but quite an exciting time. Chardonnay itself, there's obviously a big symposium, I gather, put together quite quickly, but which drew some megastars from around the world to come and shine a spotlight on Australian Chardonnay. So could you just run through what you were pleased to be presenting at that symposium and some ideas that struck you as the important takeaways from it?
The theme that came out of that, Chardonnay is the most exciting white grape variety in the entire world because it does express individual sites very clearly, but it also, there's enough room in there, there's enough kind of stuff to allow the thumbprint of the house or the winemaker. And it's not that one necessarily has to dominate the other, they can actually both coexist more than any other white variety. And the other thing that I think came out of it was Australian Chardonnay, New World Chardonnay, but certainly Australian Chardonnay is maybe the greatest value wine in the entire world, because if you part with a little bit of money, a little bit more than $30-40, you can get something that's just world class and quite exciting. If you're prepared to part with a bit more money, you can get something that's just, a complete experience. And that's not much money compared to what they're charging for some of the European Chardonnays that we come across. So they're kind of like stratospheric now in price. Like we can't afford to drink white Burgundy. We can taste it occasionally if we're lucky, but we can't buy it anymore. But we can all afford modern Australian Chardonnay. There'll be special occasion wines and there'll be wines that you'll drink more regularly. And they're world class. And the other thing that I think was quite exciting out of that is that we've got over, as Australians, we've got over that cultural cringe of trying to make something else. We're now clearly making, wines that are from the Yarra Valley. And those wines from the Yarra Valley might be from the Upper Yarra or the Lower Yarra Valley, and then they will also then express the house style, whether it's an Oak Ridge house style or a Giant Steps house style or a Yering Station house style or a Hoddles Creek house style. There'll be an individual thumbprint, but they clearly show their region. And by that, just to use an example, Yarra Valley Chardonnay generally in a cooler year carries this real citrus curd, a lemon curd, maybe a grapefruit from the high altitude sites or the really cold sites. And in a warmer year, it's still got that citrus line, but it's going to maybe carry a little bit of white stone fruit. And, even from a very ripe site, it might just go slightly into the yellow stone fruit. But there's that kind of flavour range that Yarra seems to sit within. And I think when you look at a horizontal across a certain vintage made by a handful of winemakers, you can clearly see that theme, but with the, the overlay of the winemaker or the house in there. There was an era when we were trying to make something that we're emulating something we'd seen over in Burgundy, and, we've got over that, which is great. It's good to have some international people here, really, really good to get their perspective, probably for us to have a commentary from outside of Australia about what we're doing. And I got the impression by the end of it that we're probably on the right track, by drilling down to single vineyards. There was a bit of a discussion from particularly one of the UK guys about he kind of missed the old style where things were a bit juicier and warmer and more cuddly. But I think we all probably agree we've moved on from that. Not to say there's not a place for that, and there are still people making those styles. But as a wine community, I think modern Australian Chardonnay is probably moving into something that's much more about length and drive and elegance and persistence and texture than it is necessarily. I mean, doing flavour in Australia is easy, right? We've got plenty of sun. The challenge is to do something that's got elegance and length and persistence and texture over flavour, I think.
It's funny, actually, since sort of looking at some of those comments, though, it sort of dawned on me that there are actually, and this is the thing, we might be holding the spotlight to a certain style of Chardonnay which shows just phenomenal class and elegance and length and definition. There's almost like there is a category there, and that is our fine Chardonnay picture. But there is actually a large variety of Chardonnay still being made here for different customers. It's just that maybe we don't talk about them we don't put them on a pedestal, but they're still here, which might get overlooked.
No, you're right. That came up. Yep, that came up too. And, there's an audience definitely for drinking wines that do carry that kind of, they're a bit more generous.
Yeah, and they're out there. Vintage to vintage and grower to grower and price to price. They're out there too. So I think that's something that shouldn't be forgotten. There's a lot in the Chardonnay world for various different types of drinkers in different places.
Oh, yeah,
as well.
yeah. And we're definitely talking about and commenting on the pointy end. But, then go back to wine like Lewin that's got concentration, power, flavour. But it's also got finesse and drive and length and elegance and goes into the cellar for 20 years and comes out looking amazing. So, yeah, we're definitely commenting on that pointy bit. Yeah.
And just on a slightly different tack, from Giant Steps and Innocent Bystander, that engine room of energy and creativity that you had there, just if you would mention a few people that you worked with around that time.
And the thing I probably missed the most that I've left kind of like running a winery and being responsible for that is actually being responsible for the team and the staff, because we had some incredible people come through Innocent Bystander and Giant Steps. I mean, back in the early days, it was Dan Stocker and Don Valentine and Nina Stocker. And then, along comes someone like Tim Shand, and he had his little chapter there. And a lot of people who worked in that 2IC role became, for me, probably some of the more inspirational people in my wine career. I got so much out of working with Shandy and so much out of working with Julian Grounds and people who are working in that role in the winery, because they're the ones who've got this next level of energy and they're kind of driving and pushing you on things and, discussing pretty much everything we were doing. Jess Clark, Tony Fickers, and then obviously now Giant Steps in the hands of Mel Chester. And Mel's just, I could talk to you about Mel for hours. She's young and she's got an incredible amount of energy, but she's got an intelligence and a kind of a lateral thinking. And I think the people who probably inspire me the most these days, the mentors I think of now are the kind of younger crew around the Yarra Valley. And most of them have come through, that era of working at Innocent Bystander and Giant Steps.
Yeah, that's very cool. I mean, I was just thinking when you were talking about apprenticeships, your very early days, because you've served quite a few different ones.
Yeah.
Having worked as a chef and having given the winemaking a go, having done the cheese, you've been in quite a lot of different environments, I guess. And all that probably informs a little bit it's probably not what you'd term a management style, but a way of being a member of a team and a way of pushing people forward and doing that sort of thing. Is that something you've enjoyed as well?
Absolutely. I mean, vintage is the highlight of the year. Vintage is where it's the bell curve where, 40% of the entire year's work happens in about 8 weeks. And to get through that, you assemble a team. You've got your core team that are part of the winery and vineyard crew. And then you bring in, in our case, it was probably half a dozen or 7 or 8 people. And putting together that team, it's a bit of a skill. You get better at it. And it's partly luck as well. I used to love that because sometimes you got it absolutely right and occasionally, you misjudge people and got it completely wrong. This year, Mel and I were talking, I look at the team that Giant Steps have assembled for vintage this year, 2025, and it's maybe the greatest group of humans I think I've seen in a winery at any one time in my life. And a lot of them are friends of friends or colleagues of people who worked there before, and a couple of them are ring-ins and just, where you take a complete chance. But when that gels, because really you kind of go into battle together. You're in the trenches and you're doing long days and everyone's tired. I feel to some degree that's why you come out with this sort of relationships that are quite strong. Because if you do a vintage together, you've kind of gone through battle together. You've had a real experience together, and there are friendships out of vintage that I've done around the world that I still maintain in different places. And the team, the core team in the winery and vineyard are, they become part of your life. They're your friends, they're the people you hang out with, they're colleagues and they're mentors.
And now as far as the winemaking goes these days, you're not working with quite such a big team in terms of your own project. Decades. Tell us a little bit about that project, where that came from and what you're up to.
I mean, right now I work with a bunch of people. I'm a partner in a small firm called Wine Network Consulting, and I work with an amazing bloke here, Mark O'Callaghan. Mark's from back in Hardy's days, and he's an amazing guy. But it allows me a little bit of free time to have a project on the side, which is great. And Brad Rogers came through university with us. He went to Roseworthy to learn brewing because there wasn't really a brewing school back then. So he came to wine school to become a brewer. And he worked for one of the big breweries for quite a long time, and then began Stone and Wood with a couple of mates. Way back when we used to sort of go to concerts together back at Roseworthy, we always talked about, one of these days when we sort of grow up and get big, we'll have a vineyard of our own. And we said, we should do it together one day. And it's like, yeah, whatever. And we kept talking about it for years and years afterwards. And then when I joined Wine Network and Brad had sold out of Stone and Wood, so I wasn't responsible for running a winery or facility. I had a little bit more spare time. And Brad rang me up one day and he said, look, I reckon it's time we find that vineyard. And, one thing led to another, and we were kind of lucky. This little site came up in Tasmania, the Decade site in Coal River. The vineyard was too small to be of much consequence to most of the buyers who were looking for vineyards down there. But it had a lovely couple of hills around the outside and a place to build a bit of a dam. So, I rang up Brad and I said, I think I might have found the vineyard. Fortunately, because of his financial situation, we were able to pounce on it straight away. That was back in 2022, and we made the 23 wine off that. And we've since planted another 7 hectares down there. So, it's all pretty serious now.
Awesome. What's the Pinot Chardonnay split on the vineyard?
Ultimately, it's about 85% Pinot Noir and 15% Chardonnay. There's room to put some more Chardonnay down the track, and I feel like we might still squeeze a bit more Chardonnay in on the south-facing slope.
And that was pretty cool. Your launches looked like they went off with a bang, as I'd expect. Was that quite cool to have your own name on something like that?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah. Like I said, I got into cooking because I like feeding people, and I think when you make wine, it's almost just an extension of that, really. You're making something that people enjoy, and the idea that it can go into people's cellars and they can pull it out down the track and share it with mates. Like it's the most exciting thing in the whole world. It's just incredible. It's like being in a band. You feel like if you're creating music, people are enjoying it. They're enjoying your craft, and winemaking is so much like that.
Very cool. Well, we talked about some pretty cool Chardonnay growing real estate in Australia. One place I wanted to just drag you to briefly is Beechworth, because I thought it was worth a little detour. You've done a bit of judging up in that part of the world, which I think puts you in a unique position to know what's happening. This would be an area that wouldn't be on everyone's radar. I'm sure that if they're lucky enough, they've had maybe a Chardonnay from Beechworth that hopefully has blown their mind. But what is that region like for you and that community?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Like, it's a small community up there, and it's only a fairly finite area where the Chardonnay growers are. Like, the Yarra Valley's, by comparison, quite large, and Margaret River's quite large. And then you go to a place like Beechworth, and it's really, sort of either side of that road going up, climbing a hill to Beechworth, and then sort of on the other side there's Sorenberg. So there's really a small area, and they're all doing quite individual things. Like, if you were to compare even a couple of the established ones like Giaconda, Savatier and Sorenberg, they are 3 really different wines. All 3 of them beautiful, but all 3 quite different. And then you've got the sort of the new school who've come in, like Adrian Rodder, who's come in a bit later on and made a different style again. There's a list of people past that, lots where they get smaller and smaller and more interesting and much more about the personality of the winemaker. So, but someone asked me the other day, actually, what does Beechworth Chardonnay taste like? I was kind of stumped. It was really hard to describe. And for me, Beechworth Chardonnay, the theme is kind of like a honeycomb character. It's like fresh honeycomb. When I smell it in a Chardonnay, I'm like, ooh, okay, I see this sort of Beechworth thing. It's obviously got pedigree. That's clearly there. And I think there's an exciting time ahead of it. The Northeast Victoria Wine Show, the challenge that I'm a chair of, we see all kinds of interesting Chardonnays from up there. And so it's kind of watch this space, I reckon. Yeah, there's definitely an old guard who've got this, beautiful pedigree, but there's some pretty exciting stuff happening now as well.
And it may well be a thing with Beechworth that it doesn't need to be in a pigeonhole, and it doesn't deserve to be in a pigeonhole, and it never will be, but more the fact that it's a really exciting place to be making wine or drinking wine from there.
Yeah.
On that front with the show judging, you do a fair bit of that, and I just wondered, I know it's a big question, let's just talk about what is exciting for you about show judging in terms of being part of a team and what you think that it can bring potentially to your fellow judges, producers who enter wines, to the general public if done well.
Yeah, like show judging has changed a lot. The Australian system's quite unique. I don't think there's anything like it in the whole world, where you've got a local show like the Yarra, for example, which in theory feeds, the state show, Melbourne, the capital city show, which in theory, this doesn't happen exactly like this, but that in theory feeds the national show, which is Canberra. Why would a winery enter a wine show? There's probably 2 basic reasons, and they haven't really changed. You would either go into a wine show to pick up some marketing cred, some collateral maybe. You can say we won an award, we got a silver, we got a gold, we got a trophy, and that will help you sell your wine. Or you may go into a wine show to improve the breed or effectively benchmark your wines and work out where you sit and try and get better. You might try and achieve both, but sometimes there's sort of two different avenues or two different reasons to go in. And I think what's happening now is, and a lot of judges, certainly way ahead of me, have put a lot of work into getting it to this stage, but the wine show now is very diverse. It used to be, if you wind back even when I was a young winemaker, it was a bunch of blokes really. And now there's such a different range of judges, from trade, from media, from technical. There's a lot of wine judges are coming in from viticulture. The gender diversity is much healthier. It's still got some way to go, but it's way better than it used to be. And wine shows all of a sudden are less about kind of having a strong opinion by the judges and more about just seeking out beauty and texture and finesse. That's what's really exciting about it. But, the same structure's there that's always been there. That sort of local show, capital city show, national show. But I think it's the diversity of judges and the judging criteria that's changed. Looking at it now, it's actually quite an exciting place to be in. And I wasn't that interested in wine shows when I was a young winemaker. I'm not that competitive. I don't like raising my voice much. It just wasn't for me. It wasn't my scene. I absolutely love it now because it's just full of different people. It's full of young people. It's full of, people who've got varying opinions. It's the discussions are discussions, not arguments, and no one's telling people what to do. It's obviously got to be run by someone who's in charge, but it's more of a creative sort of diplomatic process than necessarily, run by someone who's driving it a certain way, I think.
It's interesting that you say that it's changing quite quickly, because I think it is, and I don't think necessarily it's going in a certain direction. It's more changing quickly because that diversity of voices that you have there and the way that people are probably being more thoughtful about what the communication is for and what the benchmarking is for, that it's maybe an exciting space to watch because it's trying something and it's thinking and it's evolving.
It's evolving. That's really important, I think.
It might be harder to explain exactly the value of that, but there's certainly a value there.
Yeah. Look, I think, we say to a lot of our mates and our clients too, like, wine shows are expensive too because they cost money to put on. So you've got to pay your entry fee, and you should always enter your local show. You support your local show. It's just like if you're a farmer, you put your chickens and your pumpkins into your local show. You need to be involved. It's part of the community. You're part of the community. So, they're generally celebrations and events that people really get behind. Then you can start to think about whether you might go in certain capital shows, or if you're lucky enough, get into the national show because your wine's won an award somewhere else, because it becomes a real financial investment and you've got to maybe give that some thought. You've got to have a budget. You've got to work out where you want to, why you want to be in the show for a start, and then how much you're prepared to invest in it as well. So you can be a little bit strategic about what you go in, depending on what your motivation is. But I just think that the creative process of actually getting right, drilling down to the ones that win gold medals and trophies is a much better process now than what I think it was 25 years ago. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, and I guess as the wine show system works out its benefits and how to present them, I suppose one of the things is it is supposed to be giving something potentially to the end consumer. At the same time, I just wondered from your point of view, I mean, you've obviously worked in so many different parts of the food/drinks industry around the world and had lots of different interactions with people. What are the things that you would love people who don't necessarily identify themselves as, say, consumers of wine media or on the inside of this picture? What would be the things that you'd love them to sort of learn about wine or be part of?
If you're into wine, and look, let's face it, we're all tourists. We're curious. And if you're curious and you're into understanding what regions are about and what people are about and what communities are about, you can roll into anywhere in the world. And I'm just going to land, if you land somewhere like in Margaret River or Beechworth, as you said before, or, whether it's up in near Etna in Italy, if you go in and go into a winery and talk to the people who've planted that vineyard, who make that wine, who live in that community, about what they do and what drives them and sort of flavors and the food that you're eating with it, you get a really good, deep understanding of that community. And I think it just defaults to that, a wine and a winemaker and a wine grower, the person growing it particularly, but the person who's in that community making it, that's showing you that wine, is going to automatically give you a taste of that region and that culture. When you start exploring, like I often think, this is my own personal journey particularly, there's lots of wine out there. There's red wine, white wine, there's full body, there's light body, there's perfumed wines, there's, steely white wines, there's salty wines that are becoming quite interesting and exciting too. But for me, when I discovered Pinot Noir, it was like I'd climbed over a fence and seen a view that I'd never seen before. And I was like, I just want to go exploring into that I want to go into that area. I want to go and play over there. And I haven't really stopped because, one lifetime, just that one variety, there's so much to learn, so much to explore, so much to see that, if that's what floats your boat, and it certainly floats my boat, I'll never stop learning about Pinot Noir. But if you're just curious about flavour and taste too, the wine community and I hate saying the word wine industry, so I'm going to keep replacing that with community every time I say it. There's so much to explore, so much flavour and so much texture to explore.
And so Pinot Noir floats your boat. What are the kind of things that really excite you in the world of wine, either people who are working with it, regions, grape varieties, Australia and the rest of the world?
Yeah, look, this is a bit boring, but if we just go back to the two standards, Pinot and Chardonnay, I think there's massive opportunity for Chardonnay in Tasmania. I think, you can rattle off 10 Pinot producers in Tasmania who are doing really exciting stuff. But when it comes to great Tasmanian Chardonnay, you can come up with 2 or 3 pretty quickly, but then you've got to think after that. And I reckon that's an unexplored territory still down there. And I say that because, again, I think in Tasmania, particularly in the drier parts of Tasmania, you can achieve flavour and sugar quite comfortably. But to get finesse and elegance and minerality and longevity and length and stuff, it's a bit harder. It doesn't come quite as easily as Pinot, but I think the highs can be much, much higher. And I feel like watch that space. There's some exciting things happening down there right now. We've only had a couple of cracks at it with decades, but I can already see which direction we're going to go in. Some of those Mediterranean white varieties I think are going to be very exciting, particularly in our climate down here. A guy named Lockie, he's ex-Movida. He's got a company called Cortez Trading. He deals almost uniquely in Canary Islands and Greek and Spanish wines. And he put on a tasting of these white wines that I've never experienced before in my life. These sort of salty, briny, really cool white wines that just leave you salivating and hungry for a bowl of sardines or something. So that's an area I want to learn more about. I don't really understand that, to be honest. We tried a few at the Alternative Varieties Wine Show as well, and you think of what potential on some of the islands around our coast could do. Like Kangaroo Island should be growing these things, for example, I reckon. Just stick a couple out there and see what it look like. And I'm learning late in life, I'm coming to the mezcal agave kind of thing. I'm beginning to learn more about that, and I find that quite exciting. The agave story is just ridiculous in terms of like wacky wines and wacky drinks. Not wines, obviously, drinks, but each one of those that you come across just comes with a complete backstory that's kind of crazy, kind of wacky. So I love the fact that a drink can be associated with such incredible stories and histories. Like I said with Pinot, there's still a whole lifetime, certainly the rest of my life, and probably the next time I come back on the earth in my next life, there's still more to learn about Pinot Noir. It'll never stop.
Another lifetime.
Another one, yeah.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you've enjoyed listening to it, please like, subscribe, and share with your tribe. Seriously, it makes a big difference. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmarison.substack.com. Feel free to leave a comment too. I'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of. But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Elizabeth Clancy for the edits, and to my guest, Steve Flamsteed. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.